Okay, thank you, Ed, and we appreciate being here. I unfortunately, while the app promises Vivek Shinde, I am not him. Perhaps I should be. He's a lot younger and better looking. But in any event, I'd like to speak to you this afternoon about our RSVF vaccine and the results of our studies in older adults, both our phase 3, E301, and very briefly about a reimmunization study, E202. So, our safe harbor statement, just so that everyone knows these are forward-looking comments. Now, approximately a year ago, really, where was Novavax and where was Novavax's RSVF vaccine? Just to brief those of you who don't know, it's a baculovirus SF9 insect cell-derived recombinant nanoparticle vaccine based on the F protein. We know that in both animals and humans, it induces antibodies to site 1, site 2, and site 4. It also induces neutralizing antibodies and a broadly specific anti-F IgG response. It's provided protection against challenge, both with active and passive immunization of mice, of cotton rats, and of infant baboons. And as we'll talk about briefly, at this time last year, we were looking at results of a phase 2 trial in older adults, which showed efficacy against clinical RSV endpoints that we'll describe in just a second. We've amplified that information by looking at serologic evidence of infection in trials of the vaccine in women of childbearing age and showed a fairly consistent 50% reduction in those. And as my colleague Allison August will describe tomorrow, we've shown that the antibodies that this vaccine induces are efficiently transferred transplacentally. However, the key result last year was that we had completed a phase 2 trial in 1,600 older adults in the 2014-15 season. And very briefly, this had produced in that population a very benign safety profile, about 5-fold increases in palivizumab competitive and anti-F antibodies with somewhat lower increases in microneutralization titers, but not unexpectedly so. That trial had a 4.9% placebo attack rate of acute respiratory symptoms associated with RSV in an elderly population, and we had demonstrated a statistically significant 41% efficacy against that endpoint, and more encouragingly, a 64% efficacy against what we call moderate to severe lower respiratory tract disease, an endpoint we've negotiated with CBER, which involves 3 of a panel of 5 lower respiratory tract symptoms and RSV positivity. So based on that, we moved forward into a phase 2 trial last fall. Phase 3, I'm sorry. And just to remind you, these are the Kaplan-Meier curves from the phase 2, where we saw actually a very consistent protection against acute respiratory disease associated with RSV that persisted throughout the season and was statistically significant. So we were strongly encouraged by this result. And we launched into a phase 3 trial, which is RSV E301. That trial had a target population of older adults, 60 years and older, actually fairly broad eligibility criteria, so a range of comorbidities were allowed, really excluding only known immunodeficiency states. There was randomized, observer-blind, and placebo-controlled with 1-to-1 randomization in 60 sites in the United States. We used either an active vaccine, which comprised 135 micrograms of our RSVF protein, or a formulation buffer placebo. Subjects who had had the 2015-16 or who had not had the 2015-16 inactivated influenza vaccine were offered administration on day 0, and approximately 3/4 of those individuals accepted. Subjects were stratified based on age, based on prior or day 0 inactivated influenza vaccine, based on the presence of CHF and COPD, and based on their residence in congregate living settings like assisted living or long-term care, although there turned out to be very few of those. We looked at serology across the trial, and more importantly, did active and passive surveillance for RSV disease from 14 days after immunization through 1 May of this year, with 2 endpoints: RSV-associated acute respiratory disease, essentially any symptomatology, and RSV-associated moderate to severe lower respiratory tract disease, as I defined earlier. The enrollment period ran 9 November to 12 December, during which time we enrolled 11,856 subjects, and the last day 182 follow-up occurred on 13 June of this year. This looks at the characteristics of the population. As you can see, very well balanced, with a mean age of approximately 70. 3/4 of the subjects were 60 to 75 years old. Just less than a quarter were over 75. We had targeted 25% over 75 and came very close to that. A very small number over 85. 42-58 male-female split, and roughly 88% white, 10% black, and about 3% individuals of self-assigned Hispanic ethnicity. About 7.5% of subjects had either CHF or COPD, and that was very nicely randomized across the population. As I said before, very, very few subjects were living in congregate living arrangements. And about 55% of the total trial population had inactivated influenza vaccine before enrollment. 45% had not. Of that 45%, 36% accepted it on day 0, and 9%, oddly enough, in a vaccine trial, refused to receive influenza vaccine. But all of these features clearly well balanced. Now, let's look at the safety data first. And what you see is, again, a very well-balanced picture. The only real imbalance of note here occurs in the local solicited treatment emergent adverse events. So soreness and swelling at the injection site, which was about 3% more common in vaccinees than placebos. Virtually all of that was mild to moderate and transient. Severe vaccine reactogenicity was in the range of 1.3 to 1.6% in both groups, with only a marginal difference between vaccine and placebo. And as you can see in the high-level tabulation below, there was really very little to choose between the vaccine and placebo, and this iterated our prior experience with this vaccine in the phase 2, where vaccine was really indistinguishable from placebo. Drilling down on this just a little bit, what I've done to focus on the bad stuff is look at subjects with any serious adverse event and show you the frequency of adverse events in various body system, MEDRA body systems. And in short, you can see differences here between the vaccinees and the placebos are at the level of 1 per 1,000. And there's virtually nothing with more than a most marginal difference unfavorable to the vaccine. So essentially, the vaccine has a very benign safety profile, which is a good thing, because this is the data that you've been waiting for, which looks at the efficacy of the vaccine against the primary endpoint, which is moderate to severe lower respiratory tract disease. And you can see that there is basically no efficacy. Actual point estimate is minus 7.9%, but obviously the confidence interval hugely spans 0. And you can see 26 events in the placebo group and 28 in the vaccine group. Now, those of you who are remembering will remember that there was, in the bottom line, about a 1.75% incidence rate of this same endpoint in the phase 2 trial, which is fourfold less common in this data set. You can see in the placebo group it's 0.44%, and we'll return to that a little bit later. The upper analysis there is the per protocol analysis. There was really only a 47 subject difference between the per protocol and the ITT populations, and there's virtually no difference in the results of this analysis in those two populations. I've broken out some prominent strata there, and what you can see is that the results basically bracket 0 between the various groups. The huge negative efficacy in subjects with COPD or CHF is really an artifact of very, very, very small numbers in that group, in that stratum. One thing that I would bring up is the observation of the difference in efficacy in subjects who did and did not have inactivated influenza vaccine administered on day 0. And again, although neither of these are significant, you can see that most of that negative efficacy that contributes to that 0 estimate is really accumulated in the group that got co-administration. So let's keep that in mind. We move to the next slide, which looks at the secondary endpoint, which was any acute respiratory disease which was associated with RSV. And we see a rather reminiscent result here. In this case, there was marginal positive efficacy, about 12.6%, although not statistically significant. And you can see the same pattern in the various informative strata below, and the same pattern associated with co-administration of inactivated influenza vaccine. Once again, the efficacy analysis is virtually identical in the per protocol and the ITT populations, and it is notable for about a 2.5-fold decrement in the incidence rate of this endpoint from 2014-15 to 2015-16. We did look at a number of other endpoints, including healthcare utilization outcomes associated with acute RSV disease. And not terribly surprising, these assorted with the findings for RSV-ARD, and we saw most of these categories with a small positive efficacy against physician calls, physician office visits, urgent care clinic visits, and any outpatient intervention for an RSV illness. There were only 2 hospitalizations that we could document using the protocol specified RT-PCR methodology as being associated with an RSV illness, and they were both in the placebo group. Now, we also stepped back from that and said, is it possible that we know it's possible, because one of the most vexatious things in these studies is attempting to capture the RSV causation of hospitalizably severe illness, because these people, just as you or I, if they're sufficiently severely ill to see their physician or to betake themselves to an emergency room, most often, they simply go, and they don't notify the study staff until 3, 4, 5 days later, when we find out, very often in the context of a serious adverse event report, that they've been hospitalized for a respiratory illness. So in order to capture that, at least in part, and see if we had an impact on that, we basically looked at all-cause or not necessarily virologically confirmed hospitalizations, and we saw, again, there's the two proven hospitalizations, but we also saw a 22.5% efficacy against any respiratory diagnosis hospitalization, and a somewhat lower number, about 11% efficacy against any cardiac or respiratory hospitalization. And that basically went away if you took away the cardiorespiratory component. And the longer you followed this group out past the RSV season, the impact on hospitalization dwindled. But while these are not significant, they're suggestive that we may have been having an impact on respiratory hospitalizations generally, possibly because of hospitalizations related to RSV events that we simply couldn't make a diagnosis on. When we turned and looked at the immunogenicity, we found a pattern very, very similar to the phase 2 trial. These are, this is a subset of data. Much of these analyses are still going on. We have 12,000 subjects worth of multiple assays to work through. These are data from 447 subjects. And what you see basically is no real response in the placebo group, which is expected. The 4.7% seroresponse rate is because that's defined based on the 95th percentile of the placebo group performance at that point. And we see approximately a 6-fold rise in anti-FIgG, about 4.5-fold, moving to a 5-fold rise in palivizumab competitive antibody levels, and roughly a 90% seroresponse rate for both of those. When we move to microneutralization titers, we see roughly a 1.7-fold rise in the vaccine group for RSVA microneutralization, and 1.9-fold rise in RSV-B microneutralization titers. One of the things that sticks out here that is different from our prior data was that the RSV-B titers are about twice what they have been, even at baseline, in our prior experience with older adult groups. And one of the things that this causes us to speculate about is with the enriched RSV-B year that many sites experienced last year, do these people have enhanced baseline immunity coming into the trial? In any event, this magnitude of response is almost identical to the magnitude we saw in the successful phase 2. So there's no obvious smoking gun here relative to the phase 2. The increases in microneutralization are not huge, but they're what we saw before in the context of success. So to summarize this, the safety profile was consistent with the phase 2. It wasn't efficacious. The disease rates were markedly lower than expected, and markedly lower from, in contrast with the literature and in contrast with our own experience the year before. The immunogenicity results were broadly consistent with phase 2. So in the same year, and we'll discuss that trial a bit more, in the same year, we re-immunized the people who were treated in the phase 2 trial, and got about 1,330 of the original 1,600 subjects back. As you can see, we re-randomized both the vaccinees and the placebos in the original 201 trial to receive either a second iteration of the vaccine or to receive placebo, and therefore look at residual efficacy in a second year, to receive a new dose of vaccine if they had gotten placebo originally. So really this should confirm 301 results or get placebo and constitute a continuing true placebo group. And what we saw was about the same. The safety profile was exactly the same, about a 5 to 6% increase in mild injection site pain, and otherwise nothing remarkable in terms of safety of receiving a second dose. The surveillance in the placebo group, again, revealed 2.4% of acute respiratory disease in the placebo group, and moderate to severe lower respiratory tract disease of about 0.3%. So numbers very acceptably close to what we saw in the concurrent phase 3 trial. In terms of efficacy, there was no evidence of residual protection at all. In the second year after an initial dose, there was no efficacy of a single dose, which confirmed 301 very nicely. Sticking out from that was the group that got a second dose that had 75 and 100% efficacy against either acute respiratory disease or moderate to severe lower respiratory tract disease. The analyses of immunogenicity are ongoing. Actually, the immunogenicity in the second dose group is no better, perhaps lower than the other groups. So we have a little bit of a dichotomy there. Now, we were astonished in the face of the phase 2 data, and we undertook a number of evaluations. There were no obvious trial design differences that could explain this result, and so we looked for flawed conduct, we looked for differences between the test articles, and we looked for and considered the potential impact of a low attack rate. And very briefly, because time is flying on me, site performance was really quite good. There was about a 49% of all subjects reported at least one illness. 83% of those were swabbed, which is right in line with such trials as Sanofi's high-dose trial in this population. 98% of the swabs were taken within 5 days of the first complaint of illness, and when we looked, there was really no gradient in RSV positivity across those 5 days. And we saw no evidence that 50 newly trained sites that we'd recruited for this trial performed significantly worse than the experienced E201 sites. We were concerned about the performance of the RT-PCR laboratory, which had not changed in either location or technology from E201. We performed an extensive validation of that assay in situ in the lab after agreeing the protocol with CBER, and that passed with flying colors, and then we carried out multiple proficiency tests spanning the course of the trial, and the site and the laboratory performed flawlessly with 100% sensitivity and specificity on really large proficiency panels spiked at the limit of detection of the assay. So no real concern about the RT-PCR lab. I should also say they came away with plenty of coronaviruses and rhinoviruses, so we believe sampling was generally good. Influenza detection was late and low, just like the rest of the season. The randomization performance was audited and no problem at all, error rate of 0.4%. So there were no obvious conduct issues. We have examined the product extensively by a number of biophysical methods. We can't find any differences between the E201 and the E301 product to this point. We are going out to using really gross tools, for example, harvesting sera that were developed during these trials and using them in passive protection of animals to see if there's something we cannot find by a biophysical method that's still going on with the antigen. We really don't expect to find anything, but we're going to look. So there's no obvious evidence of a vaccine product difference. Then we began to think of whether there's a potential influence of a low attack rate. And those of you who have hung around flu for a number of years know that there is modulation of detectable efficacy by attack rate, which is well recognized in flu. Here's a couple of examples. I'm sure the first example from Michigan is one that Dr. Monto will remember very well, in which low attack rate of 1.8% led to a 16% efficacy in a year when the H3N2 antigen was actually better matched than it was in the years which bracketed that gave 70 to 75% efficacy. And a similar experience in the Czech Republic just a little later, in which the same vaccine, well matched, gave 25% efficacy in a low attack rate year and 67% in a high attack rate year. And it occurred to us that our trial with RSV is the only other really big trial which addresses the elderly population and an annually occurrent respiratory virus to which immunity is incomplete, but that we know modulates population resistance. We looked to see if this was potentially a generalized phenomenon. Here is some data that Dr. Monto will present here and has kindly given to us. This looks at data in Michigan, but it's an exemplar of data that we have from several other sites, which suggests that yes, the RSV season was about 60% lower, at least in older adults, or at least in adults. Maybe doesn't show up in the data that's heavily weighted towards children, but in adults, it appears to have been a light season. And this phenomenon has actually been reduced to math in a paper published in 2007, and I won't wade through this, but suffice it to say, the conclusion of that paper was that estimates from randomized placebo-controlled phase 3 vaccine trials that differ in baseline transmission are not comparable unless explicit control of baseline transmission is taken into account. And how to do that going forward is a very interesting question, but it suggests that we may participate in the same past history of low efficacy estimates in the face of low attack rates. We actually sliced and diced our study sites and looked at both attack rate and efficacy as a function of geography, and lo and behold, post hoc of course, with 2 to 3-fold differences in attack rate, we actually see respectable, or moving towards respectable, efficacy estimates against acute respiratory disease when we look at the geographies where there's a higher attack rate. So, I'm certainly out of time by now. Unlike 201, E301 obviously failed to show efficacy. The safety profile was fine. There was no clear decrement in immunogenicity. And from all our investigations, the results appear to be valid. So we're stuck with it. The E202 data show that anti-F immunogenicity at least shows vaccine responses in the active groups that we expect, and gives us a little bit suggestive evidence of efficacy in subjects that received a second annual dose. But we realize that that's based on very small numbers. So where do we go from here? Well, we don't give up. We're going to continue in the development of the RSV-F vaccine candidate. Our immunogenicity is notably more vigorous in younger adult subjects, including pregnant women, and in phase 1 studies, especially in children, where it was markedly stronger. And also is particularly potent in young adults who enter trials with low microneutralization titers. So we believe that these risk groups may continue to benefit from the current formulation. There are several avenues available to us to look at enhanced immunogenicity. and potentially efficacy in older adults, including either adjuvantation, certainly avoidance of co-administration with IIV, and potentially new regimens as well. So the other thing which sticks out here is that the current suite of immunologic endpoints is probably not adequately capturing protective responses or not adequately identifying them in the morass that occurs in the elderly based on all their prior immunologic experience. And as we begin to peel this onion of responses, we're beginning to find that there are signals that may in fact identify people who may have a much lower risk. But that's a long process. We have 12,000 subjects worth of assays to do, and of course it's always confounded, as it is in these trials, by the fact that people who are apparently protected are compounded of groups of people who are protected and people who simply aren't exposed, which is a big issue in a low attack year. So we're currently considering dosing or formulation approaches that can overcome this heterogeneity in background, and we're moving forward. So thank you.
Thank you for such a terrific summary. Now, maybe you don't have that data on the phase 3, but maybe in the phase 2. When you have your 3 assays, the palivizumab competing antibodies, the LISA for F, and your micronut, and instead of looking at population base, you focus on those who failed and those who did not. Which assay is more helpful to separate those groups?
That's a very good question, and we're actually just going through that exercise now with the phase 2 data. So check back with me on that. I think that's exactly where we are, and it's where we will be in a short period of time with the phase 3. I think that we've got some interesting inklings already. For example, one of the things that appears to be associated with resistance is, not surprisingly, increased microneutralization titers, but perhaps a little surprisingly, the presence of the palivizumab competitive antibodies before immunization, as if that picks out a group of people who have been perhaps differentially primed.
You know, there's a lot of data that flu antibodies before vaccination prevents a good response, right?
So
you may be
it may be that they predict a response, or it may be that they predict a quality of response. And we're beginning to look at those antibodies specifically in that population to see if that helps us explain what's going on here.
I'm asking Ed if I can answer. Do you think you will have data on viral load to see the viral load on those?
No, we won't. No, we won't. No, we don't have that.
Larry?
Are you going to look at strains the prior year and the year that you did the trial?
Yes, we will. Yeah, for sure.
I'm Muriel Steff from GSK. There are reports showing links between the susceptibility of the elderly and the deficient T-cell response. How do you look at that with your vaccine that seems to induce mostly an antibody response?
Well, I think that's something we're certainly aware of, and there are no T-cell studies here. But we're open to that, and we'll be exploring that as we go forward, for sure. We're quite aware of that.
I just have one sort of comment, and that would be looking at your vaccination timing went through mid-December.
Yes.
And a good proportion of your subjects were in the Southeast, and I'd be curious to know whether Tony has data. You usually see RSV in September and October. I'm sure you see it in the adults in the same population. We began in Rochester to see RSV in late October this past year. And I just wonder if you missed a good portion of the season. Well, Tony, do you have data on last year's Southeast?
We have data, and like you stated, the onset of the RSV season in the South normally starts earlier. I think last year was probably by around the third week of October, but the peak incidence starts to be really December or January. So there are potential cases that may have been missed, but you still will have the brunt of the RSV.
Yeah, I think that was our experience. We have no doubt that there were some cases that got under the door. But actually, when we look at it in terms of dates, the upstroke of RSV incidence in our subjects was in December, towards the end of December. Now, if you ask the question, now the South was fairly low for us, and so I guess it's possible to raise the question that we missed the South entirely, but I don't think so. It's not that we got no cases from the South. We just got relatively lower numbers.
Last question.
Sure.
There has been an association between the peak or the vaccination against pneumococcus and a decreased incidence of RSV. Do you know if in your population these adults were vaccinated against pneumococcus?
There was a lot. We're actually looking at that. There's a lot of immunization with the pneumococcal vaccine in this group.
Thanks,
Okay?
Lou.